The yard goes silent. A white supremacist named Tank Morrison, 6'4", built like a machine, stands over a kneeling black inmate. He spits, kicks a food tray across the concrete, and says, "Dogs eat off the ground. Crawl and lick it clean." 200 inmates watch in frozen silence. The man on his knees doesn't move. He just breathes, slow, steady. Then, for half a second, his eyes change. Not fear, not pain, something else. Something that makes Tank's stomach twist before he even knows why. Because the man he's humiliating isn't a helpless prisoner. He's the Ghost, an ex-UFC legend banned for being too dangerous to fight. And today, Tank Morrison just made the biggest mistake of his life. Riverside Correctional sat like a concrete beast on the edge of the desert, its walls breathing heat and hatred. The sound of steel doors and shouted orders was the rhythm of its life. Inside, the yard was a pit of noise until one voice cut through everything. Tank Morrison, leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, stood over a new inmate and turned the yard into his stage. Around him, his followers laughed as the man on the ground stayed still. They didn't know they were watching the first tremor of something that would break their world in two. The name on the new arrival sheet was Dante Williams. On paper, he was a first-time offender who had snapped during a bar fight. In truth, he was a ghost wearing a prison uniform. Once the most feared fighter in the world, banned for killing a man with a single strike that medical science could not explain. The press had called it a tragedy, but behind the headlines the government saw something else, a weapon with a conscience. The FBI needed that weapon inside the most corrupt prison in America. Dante had been briefed in a silent room weeks before his arrest. The agent across the table had slid him a photo of Tank Morrison, all tattoos and rage. The mission was clear: get close to the man, find the link between the Brotherhood and the Clav cartel, survive long enough to expose it. No cameras, no safety net, no backup, just endurance. Now he was here, on his knees in the dirt, while Tank's boots crunched closer. The heat shimmered off the yard. The smell of sweat, metal, and something rotten hung in the air. When Tank told him to crawl and lick the floor, Dante lowered his head and obeyed. Every eye in the yard watched, waiting for him to fight back. He didn't. His breathing stayed slow. The crowd saw weakness. Tank saw obedience. But Carlos Mendez, the ex-Marine sharing Dante's cell, saw something else. That night in their cell, Carlos studied his new roommate while the lights buzzed overhead. Dante's hands looked wrong for a street brawler. The scars were clean, symmetrical, old. He moved with precision, even when lying down. When he slept, he barely moved at all. Carlos had been trained to notice small details. This man had control wired into his bones. He wanted to ask questions, but Dante's silence was heavier than steel. Day 2 began with routine humiliation. Tank owned the guards through fear and cash. The warden looked the other way as long as the flow of drugs stayed smooth. Dante was ordered to scrub the cafeteria floors with a toothbrush while the Aryan Brotherhood lounged nearby, tossing crumbs and laughing. He didn't look up. Every stroke of the brush became a meditation. Breathe, endure, wait. At night, he sat cross-legged on the concrete, eyes closed. His mind went back to the tattoo on his back, the one that told the story of a man descending into hell for redemption. Each insult, each beating, each act of degradation was a layer of that descent. He welcomed it as penance for the man who had died in the ring. The guards hated his calm. Tank hated it more. The prison hierarchy relied on fear, and this man wasn't afraid. By the third day, Tank needed to break him publicly. The cafeteria became the theater. Hundreds of inmates stopped eating when Tank rose from his table. His shadow fell over Dante as he carried his tray. Tank's hand slammed it to the floor. The noise echoed off the concrete walls. Food scattered across the ground. "Did I say you could eat, boy?" The room froze. Phones appeared, recording. Tank grabbed the microphone from the guard station and announced the show. Dante stripped down to his undershirt, the tattoo stretching across his back like fire and scripture. The older inmates recognized it. The younger ones just stared. Tank dumped slop over Dante's head and ordered him to crawl. The crowd laughed until something in the air shifted. For a heartbeat, the man on the floor moved differently. His knees planted in perfect balance, his hands spread just enough to guard his center line. It lasted half a second, but it was the difference between prey and predator. Tank stepped back without realizing it, then forced a laugh. The moment passed. Dante finished the crawl, cleaned the mess, and left without a word. The video hit the internet hours later. The comments were full of hate. No one knew the FBI was already watching. Carlos confronted him that night. "You could have ended that giant in 2 seconds," he said. Dante kept cleaning his knuckles with a rag. Endurance is part of the fight. Carlos didn't understand then, but he would. Day 4 turned cruel. Tank forced Dante to clean the communal toilets by hand. The stench clawed at his lungs, but he worked silently until his fingers bled. When the guards laughed, he looked at them with eyes that made them stop for a second too long. The Aryans called him Toilet Boy. Tank said he could sleep beside his work. That night, Dante lay on the wet floor beside overflowing bowls while boots splashed around him. He used the stink as focus. Breathe. Endure. Wait. Day 6, Tank went live. He called it Monkey Trainin' 101. The live stream drew thousands of white supremacists who paid to watch humiliation in real time. Dante was ordered to crawl, bark, roll over. Each act of degradation fed Tank's ego and his bank account. Donations scrolled across the screen. The laughter of invisible strangers filled the prison speakers. In the corner, Carlos watched in silence. Every movement Dante made was too clean, too deliberate. He was measuring Tank's patterns, memorizing timing, learning habits. The Marine recognized recon work. The ghost wasn't breaking. He was studying. By the end of the week, Tank's paranoia grew. He searched prison databases, called in favors, demanded files. Dante's record was blank beyond the bar fight. No juvenile charges, no traffic violations, nothing. That kind of clean didn't exist. The warden told him to drop it. Tank couldn't. His gut screamed danger. He decided to test it. In the machine shop, he heated a metal spoon and planned to brand his name into Dante's back during shower time. The Brotherhood circled like vultures. Tank pressed the red-hot metal to Dante's skin. The flesh sizzled. Dante didn't move. Tank pressed harder for the second letter. That's when the ghost shifted his weight, just enough to unbalance the giant. The spoon slipped and seared Tank's own hand. Dante caught his arm before he fell. The move was so fast it didn't look real. "Accident," he said calmly. Tank's burned hand told him otherwise. He didn't sleep that night. The image replayed in his mind, that half-step, that precision. He'd seen fighters. He'd seen killers. This was something else. The next day, Tank organized a sparring session under the guise of training. 3 of his biggest men against Dante. No rules. The crowd gathered, betting cigarettes and pills. The blows rained down, but Dante's body absorbed them like water. He turned with every punch, redirected every kick. He didn't fight back, only defended. The crowd started whispering. How could a man take that much punishment without bruising? How could he move like that while tied down by chains? When it ended, Tank felt something new. Not anger, fear. That night, Carlos found Dante sitting cross-legged again. "You don't even breathe like the rest of us," he said. "Who are you really?" Dante didn't answer. Instead, he asked about Afghanistan, about how you survive in a place where every day is hell. Carlos said you learn to control what you can. Dante nodded. Same rule applies here. The following morning, the water in the showers turned boiling hot. A pipe malfunction Tank had arranged through a paid-off guard. The others screamed and ran. Dante stepped into the spray, skin blistering instantly. He turned off the valve with bare hands and began treating the burns with wet cloths torn from his bedding. No sound, no complaint. Tank watched the footage later, shaking his head. Agent Sarah Carter, still undercover as a counselor, saw the injuries and kept her voice steady. "How are you adjusting?" "The ghost walks among them still," Dante answered. The code was clear. He was still in control. But the pressure inside Riverside was shifting. Tank's men were beginning to whisper. Some respected the new inmate's silence. Others feared it. A few even stopped following orders. In a place built on dominance, that was poison. Tank couldn't allow it. He needed a public example. He decided to give the yard a show they'd never forget. The announcement spread by dinner. A special event. Everyone knew what that meant. A fight, brutal and final. Tank called it the dog fight. The opponent would be Tommy Bulldog Smith, his best enforcer, a slab of muscle who once boxed semi-professionally. Weapons would be involved. The guards were told to look the other way. That night in the cell, Carlos watched Dante stretch in slow motion, every muscle controlled. His movements flowed like a river, no wasted energy. It wasn't practice, it was prayer. The Marine realized he wasn't looking at a fighter anymore. He was watching a man preparing for something sacred. When lights went out, Dante sat on his bunk, hands open on his knees. Each breath slowed until the noise of the prison faded into nothing. Tomorrow he would step into the circle. Tomorrow he would reveal what the ghost truly was. The next morning, the yard became an arena. 400 inmates formed a ring around the open ground. Tank stood with his crew and his cameras, ready to broadcast another humiliation to the world. Guards disappeared like ghosts themselves. The air buzzed with hunger. The crowd wanted blood. In his cell, Dante laced his fingers, touched the scar on his wrist, and whispered a silent promise. Not revenge, justice. The steel door opened. He walked toward the light, and with that step, the ghost entered hell. The steel door closed behind Dante with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire prison. Every step he took toward the yard felt heavier than the one before, but his breathing stayed steady. The sunlight hit his face as he stepped into the circle that 400 inmates had formed. The air smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and something close to fear. Tank Morrison stood at the center of it all, his burned hand wrapped in a crude bandage, his grin as wide as ever. This was his empire. 8 years of dominance built through fear and humiliation. Every man in Riverside Correctional had bent to the knee at some point, and Tank expected this new inmate to break like the rest. He didn't yet understand that he was standing on the edge of his own downfall. The dogfight wasn't just a fight. It was ritual. Tank's way of maintaining control through violence and spectacle. His followers had set up stolen cameras, streaming everything to the Brotherhood's online audience. Cash flowed in from hate groups around the country who believed they were watching a public degradation. For Tank, it was business and pleasure rolled into one. Tommy Bulldog Smith was already waiting, shirtless, veins bulging, his Aryan tattoos glistening in the sunlight. The blade, hidden in his waistband, was small but deadly, filed from a cafeteria spoon and wrapped with cloth. He'd been ordered to make it look accidental, a brawl gone wrong. The guards would turn their backs, and the cameras would show another tragic prison fight between enemies. No one would question it. Dante stepped into the ring. The crowd jeered, hurling insults and slurs. He ignored them. His eyes were calm, locked on Tommy, but his awareness stretched wider. Every movement, every vibration in the air. The rhythm of Tank's breathing, the sound of a guard's boots, the placement of every exit. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was mapping the battlefield. Tank raised a megaphone and began his show. The announcer's voice carried across the yard like thunder. The undefeated champion of the Brotherhood, Tommy Bulldog Smith, 240 pounds of white power. The crowd roared. Tommy flexed his arms, throwing shadow punches, letting the adrenaline feed his performance. And in the other corner, Tank sneered, "Our entertainment, our cleaning boy, the prison monkey." The laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave. Dante said nothing. He took off his shirt, revealing his tattoo. The image of a man walking through fire toward light shimmered across his back. The noise began to die. Some of the older inmates whispered, trying to remember where they'd seen it before. Tommy circled, fists raised, taunting. Tank leaned forward, shouting through his megaphone. "Make it hurt, Bulldog, make him beg." Dante's breathing deepened. His body relaxed. His feet settled into the earth, light but grounded. Tommy charged. The first punch whistled past Dante's ear. The second cut through empty air. The third met nothing but silence. Dante's movements flowed like smoke, impossible to predict, impossible to catch. He wasn't fighting. He was waiting. The crowd fell quiet. It was like watching a dance, a rhythm too fast for the human eye to follow. Tommy grew angrier, swinging harder, losing control. The blade flashed from his waistband. The crowd gasped. Tank grinned. That was the moment he'd been waiting for. In the span of a blink, everything changed. Dante shifted his weight by inches. The knife missed his ribs by the width of a finger. His hand tapped Tommy's wrist with surgical precision. The blade dropped harmlessly to the dirt. Another movement, soft as a whisper, touched Tommy's temple. The man fell before his brain could register what had happened. One moment, he was alive with fury. The next, he was motionless, unconscious, his body folding like an empty shell. Silence filled the yard. Even Tank didn't move. The entire prison stood still as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Then a voice shouted from somewhere in the crowd, "Holy hell, that's the ghost." The spell broke. The yard erupted. Inmates screamed, phones rose, cameras flashed. The name spread like a firestorm. The ghost. The undefeated fighter they all thought was dead. The man who ended careers with a touch. The legend who vanished after killing a man in the cage. Tank froze. The cameras that were supposed to humiliate his prisoner now streamed his own defeat to millions. The video raced through the internet faster than he could imagine. #PrisonGhost began to trend within hours. By nightfall, every sports network was replaying the moment in slow motion. Analysts debated whether what they had seen was even humanly possible. Dante was led away in chains. The crowd parted for him, silent, reverent. Tank watched from the ground, clutching his burned hand. His empire had cracked. The humiliation he built his power on had turned against him. In solitary confinement, Dante sat in his cell as the noise of the outside world roared beyond the walls. He could feel the storm building. The mission had shifted. His cover was gone, but the target remained. The Claw of Cartel's network still stretched across 12 states, using Tank's prison empire as its hub. The ghost had revealed himself too soon, but he could still finish what he started. Across the state, television screens played the footage on endless loops. News anchors marveled at the precision of the strike. Social media exploded with theories. Some called him a hero, others a monster. The debates filled every talk show. Should fighters trained to kill be allowed among ordinary men? The story became a cultural earthquake. Tank watched the coverage from the infirmary. His bandaged hand throbbed, but his rage burned hotter. He had spent years controlling every narrative inside these walls. Now the world saw him as a fool. His humiliation wasn't just public, it was viral. His followers whispered about the ghost like he was a myth returned from the grave. Control was slipping. He decided to fight back the only way he knew how: money and manipulation. He called in his outside contacts, lawyers, corrupt officials, media allies. Within days, a new story began to take shape. Dante wasn't an undercover agent. He was a violent criminal, a disgraced fighter who had brought his killing instincts into a peaceful prison. Agent Sarah Carter monitored the chaos from her office, her cover as counselor still intact. She knew the operation had spiraled out of control. They had planned for Dante to stay invisible for at least 6 more months. Now his identity was public. Any slip could unravel the entire investigation. The Bureau had no choice but to adapt. She drafted coded reports, alerting her superiors that Tank was moving resources faster than expected. Inside the prison, Carlos Mendez became the only person Dante could trust. He visited the solitary block under the pretense of delivering meals. Through the small window in the steel door, he whispered updates. "The video has millions of views," he said. "The world's talking about you." Dante didn't answer. He just looked at his bruised hands and said, "The world should be talking about justice." Tank's rage grew each hour. He couldn't restore control through fear alone. The whispers among inmates became louder. Some stopped obeying his orders, others refused to pay for protection. The Brotherhood was fracturing. He needed to remind everyone who ruled Riverside. He called his lieutenant, Bulldog's brother from another block. He told him to spread a message: the ghost would be punished, no matter what it took. The guards began planting contraband in Dante's cell. Reports appeared claiming he was violent, uncooperative, a danger to others. Tank's allies on the outside pushed for his transfer to another facility. At the same time, a new name entered the picture: Attorney Rebecca Cross, known for defending hate groups and twisting narratives into profit. Tank hired her through cartel money, promising $1 million bonus if she destroyed Dante's reputation. She accepted before sunrise. Within 48 hours, press conferences began. Cross appeared before cameras beside a photo of Tommy Bulldog in a hospital bed. Her voice dripped with righteous outrage. This was an unprovoked assault by a trained killer. "My client may never recover." The crowd of reporters devoured every word. The next morning, news headlines screamed, "Disgraced UFC legend attacks unarmed inmate." Talk shows debated whether martial artists should be registered as human weapons. Public opinion shifted like a tide. The ghost was no longer a symbol of resistance. He was a cautionary tale. Dante sat in his cell, watching the coverage on a small television. The same crowd that once cheered his victories now demanded his punishment. He turned off the screen and focused on his breathing. None of it mattered. The mission came first. Tank's empire had to fall. Sarah Carter visited him under the guise of a psychological evaluation. She noticed the quiet in his voice, the stillness in his eyes. He had reached a point beyond pain or anger. "You can still walk away," she said softly, careful to keep her words coded. He shook his head. Walking away means they win. Tank's paranoia reached its peak. He began studying footage frame by frame, obsessed with Dante's movements. He told himself that if he understood the ghost, he could destroy him. But the deeper he watched, the more he saw what frightened him most. Precision, patience, purpose, qualities he had never possessed. One night he dreamed of the fight. The way Dante had stood still while chaos unfolded. The way he had touched Tommy's temple like a mercy instead of a strike. Tank woke in a sweat, his chest tight with something he didn't recognize. Fear. The following week brought the next blow to his pride. A reporter uncovered leaked footage showing Tank giving orders during the fight. The video hinted at a setup, though not enough for arrest. Still, it added doubt. Cross moved quickly to bury the story, but the damage was done. Inside Riverside, the tension reached breaking point. Inmates formed factions. Some wanted to side with the ghost, believing he represented something stronger than fear. Others stayed loyal to Tank out of habit or hate. The balance teetered on collapse. Carlos saw it happening and realized the truth. Dante's presence had changed the prison more than violence ever could. He had shown men that silence could be strength, that patience could break chains louder than fists. When Tank walked the yard now, the laughter was quieter. The eyes that once looked at him with fear now looked through him. Control was slipping, and he knew it. He turned to the one weapon he still trusted, the legal system. Rebecca Cross filed the $10 million lawsuit that would dominate headlines. She framed it as justice for an innocent man brutalized by a violent celebrity. Tank's men spread rumors that the ghost had attacked guards, stolen drugs, conspired to incite riots. The narrative grew like rot. By the end of the second month, the Bureau had lost control of the operation's public face. Dante had become both hero and villain. Inside the walls, his silence inspired. Outside, his name was poison. Sarah Carter's coded messages became desperate. Headquarters wanted extraction. Dante refused. The cartel's network was unraveling from within, and Tank's arrogance was accelerating the collapse. To leave now would mean all of it had been for nothing. At night, Dante still meditated, his back to the concrete wall, the ghostly outline of his tattoo catching the dim light. Every humiliation, every punch, every scar had led here. The fight had awakened the world, but it also awakened Tank's desperation. He would push harder. He would strike back. And the next move would decide whether the ghost's descent into hell ended in redemption or destruction. Outside his cell, the sound of heavy boots approached. A guard's voice barked orders. "Transfer in the morning. General population." Dante opened his eyes. The air in the cell felt different, charged with the weight of something inevitable. Hell had not finished with him yet. The morning began with the rattle of chains and the hollow echo of metal doors. Dante opened his eyes before the guards reached his cell. He had already heard the footsteps, slow and heavy. carrying the rhythm of men who believed they controlled fate. The lock turned. Sunlight spilled across the floor. "Transfer to general population," one of the guards muttered. Dante stood without a word. He knew what it meant. This was not a transfer. It was a setup. The hallway felt narrower than before. The guards stayed silent as they escorted him, eyes avoiding his. Corruption had its own language, and silence was the loudest word of all. Every step down that corridor led closer to what Tank Morrison had planned. The world outside might see Dante as a monster now, but inside the walls, the ghost was a threat that had to be erased before he exposed the Empire. The cafeteria buzzed with the morning crowd. The smell of burnt eggs and metal trays mixed with sweat. Inmates glanced up as Dante entered, whispers crawling through the air. He was the man who had dropped Bulldog Smith with a single touch, the man who moved like water, the man who could not be broken. To some, he was legend. To others, a problem waiting to be solved. Tank watched from his table in the corner, eyes hidden behind cheap sunglasses. His burned hand rested on the table, wrapped in clean gauze. He looked calm, but his jaw clenched every time he saw someone glance toward Dante. Fear had become his shadow. He had spent years ruling Riverside through humiliation, and now the balance was shifting. The men he once owned through terror were looking to the ghost for something Tank could never provide: respect. Later that afternoon, Carlos found a way to meet Dante during yard hour. He had healed enough to walk again, ribs still sore from the beating Tank's men gave him. He moved with care, scanning the guards, pretending to stretch while speaking low. "They're planning something tonight. 3 men from B Block, paid off and armed." Dante nodded once, slow and calm. He already knew. The whispers reached him hours before. Information moved through the prison like smoke, invisible but everywhere. The sun sank low, painting the yard in gold and dust. Dinner time approached. Guards led inmates into the cafeteria in shifts. Dante took his place in line, holding a metal tray like any other man. The noise of conversation echoed off the concrete. Behind him, 3 men waited, faces expressionless. Their eyes darted toward Tank, who sat at his usual table pretending not to watch. Everything was in motion. The first strike came fast. A sharpened toothbrush slid toward Dante's ribs. He turned just enough for it to miss. The second man swung a blade from behind. Dante caught his wrist, redirected the momentum, and the weapon clattered to the floor. Before the third could react, Dante's elbow connected with his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. The entire cafeteria froze. The 3 attackers lay on the floor gasping. Tank stood, fury twisting his face. Guards burst in, pretending confusion. Weapons were found near the attackers. The story spread that Dante had provoked the fight. By morning, the narrative had been written. The ghost strikes again. Violence is all he knows. The media outside ate it up. Inside, the FBI watched carefully. They knew this was Tank's desperation. His empire was cracking under the weight of exposure. Attorney Rebecca Cross saw opportunity. She called a press conference within hours. Standing in front of cameras, she spoke with perfect confidence. This violent man should never have been placed among others. He's a danger to society. She painted a picture of a killer who couldn't control his instincts, a fighter who had brought the cage into the prison. Her voice dripped with righteousness, and the reporters believed every word. Within days, the lawsuit was filed. $10 million for emotional and physical damages. Civil rights violations. Assault with deadly weapons. The public ate it up. Tank's followers framed themselves as victims of celebrity violence. His story became the gospel of the weak hiding behind power. Dante's silence only made things worse. In his cell, he spent hours meditating, hands folded, mind steady. He had endured humiliation, torture, and now betrayal by the system he served. Yet he felt no anger, only the slow burn of purpose. He had known from the beginning that the road to justice would lead through hell. Now he was walking its deepest level. Agent Sarah Carter paced her small office, frustration burning behind her calm face. She couldn't contact him directly. Every channel was monitored. The Bureau wanted to protect the operation, but the media pressure was turning Dante into a liability. Cross was too good at manipulation. The edited footage she released made Dante look like a predator stalking his prey. The knife had been erased, Tommy's attacks deleted. What remained was an illusion of brutality, polished for headlines. In the world outside, the story twisted further. Talk shows debated whether trained fighters should be registered like weapons. Protests erupted outside the courthouse demanding justice for Tommy Smith. The words ghost and killer began appearing side by side on every screen. Inside Riverside, Tank felt invincible again. His name returned to the headlines, not as a monster but as a survivor. He played the role perfectly, sitting in his wheelchair during interviews, his voice breaking as he described his fear. "That man destroyed my friend's life," he said. "Tommy was just trying to defend himself." The public saw tears. They didn't see the smug smile hiding behind the performance. Carlos followed every word through the prison television. His hands clenched with anger. He wanted to shout the truth, to expose Tank for the liar he was, but he knew silence was the only thing keeping him alive. The men who attacked him before were still out there, waiting for orders. The days crawled into weeks. The legal war outside grew louder while the prison grew quieter. Dante's presence changed the air. Even those who once mocked him now gave him space. He never raised his voice, never looked for trouble, but the calm he carried made others rethink what strength meant. When the court date was announced, the entire facility buzzed. The hearing would decide his future. The lawsuit had been elevated to federal level. Attorney Cross promised to expose him completely. Tank smiled when he heard the news. He thought the battle would end in that courtroom. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Protesters waved signs that read, "Lock up the ghost and justice for Tommy." Inside, the marble halls echoed with the shuffle of cameras and whispers. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman known for her stern sense of order, presided over the case. Dante entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, wrists chained, expression calm. He looked like a man resigned to fate, but his eyes told another story. They were clear, steady, and unbroken. Across from him, Tank sat in his wheelchair, neck brace adjusted perfectly, his lawyer at his side. Rebecca Cross wore a dark suit and a smile sharper than any blade. The proceedings began. Cross presented her case with precision. She showed edited footage that began with Dante striking and ended with Tommy collapsing. The missing knife, the provocation, the setup, all erased. The story was simple. A trained killer attacked an unarmed man. She painted Tank and his men as protectors of order inside a violent institution. Her voice carried the rhythm of certainty. Every sentence landed like a hammer. Dante listened without flinching. He didn't object. He didn't interrupt. When the judge asked if he wished to speak, he only nodded. Not yet. Witness after witness testified. Paid inmates repeated memorized lies. Guards claimed they saw Dante strike first. Medical experts exaggerated Tommy's injuries, describing brain trauma that didn't exist. The performance was flawless. The spectators whispered among themselves, convinced they were watching justice unfold. Then came Tank's turn. He rolled to the stand, voice trembling as he spoke. He told the court about the fear he felt living near a man like Dante. He described sleepless nights, constant tension, the pain in his burned hand. He even thanked the guards for saving him from further harm. The courtroom fell silent when he began to cry. Cameras zoomed in. His tears glistened under the lights. Cross rested a comforting hand on his shoulder before turning to the judge. "My client has suffered enough," she said. "We ask for the maximum penalty." When it was finally Dante's turn, the room grew still. He stood slowly, chains clinking. He looked at the judge, then at Tank, then at the crowd. His voice was low but carried clearly. "I don't deny what happened," he began. "I don't deny what I am capable of. But there is something missing from this story." He turned toward Tank. "Tell them about the weapon." Cross shot to her feet, objecting. "Speculation, Your Honor." The judge raised a hand but allowed him to continue. Dante reached into his jumpsuit pocket and placed a small recorder on the table. It clicked once, and Tank's voice filled the courtroom. "Use the blade. Make it look like self-defense." The silence that followed was absolute. Cross stammered, demanding to know how a prisoner obtained such a device. The judge examined it, eyes narrowing. "Federal issue," she murmured. "Mr. Williams, where did you get this?" Dante lifted his head. "Because I'm not just a prisoner, Your Honor." The rear doors burst open. Agent Sarah Carter entered with a team of FBI agents. Her badge glinted under the lights. "Special Agent Dante Williams has been working undercover for 8 months, she announced. The courtroom erupted. Tank tried to stand but forgot his act, leaping from the wheelchair in rage. "You destroyed everything," he shouted. "You think this is over? The Clav cartel will find you." His words echoed through the chamber, sealing his fate. Every confession was recorded, every threat documented. Judge Morrison ordered silence, but the scene had already turned chaotic. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Cross tried to salvage her reputation, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Bureau presented files, bank transfers, witness statements, proof of corruption spanning years. The story that had begun as humiliation now became one of the largest criminal takedowns in federal history. Dante stood still as agents led Tank away in cuffs. The man who once ruled through fear now screamed empty threats as he disappeared through the courtroom doors. The sound faded like thunder rolling away after a storm. Outside, the world erupted with news alerts. The ghost was not a monster. He was a hero working from the inside to dismantle an empire built on hate and narcotics. The same networks that once condemned him now hailed his courage. #GhostJustice replaced the old headlines overnight. That night, Dante sat alone in a federal holding room, finally free of his chains. Sarah entered quietly, setting a file on the table. "You finished it," she said. He looked up, the exhaustion clear but his eyes calm. "Not yet," he replied. "There are still pieces left to clean." She nodded. "The raid's start in 2 hours. By morning it will all be over." Dante leaned back, letting the silence fill the space. He thought of Carlos still in the infirmary, of Tommy lying in a hospital bed pretending to be in a coma, of the men who had watched him suffer in that yard. Every one of them had seen something change inside those walls. The ghost had walked through hell, and brought light to a place that had forgotten it existed. Outside the window, the first flash of dawn touched the horizon. A new day, sharp and clear. The mission wasn't just about taking down a cartel anymore. It was about proving that even in the darkest corners of humanity, redemption could be real. And somewhere, deep in Riverside, behind layers of locked doors, Tank Morrison screamed into the darkness as the sound of sirens echoed across the yard. The night after the courtroom exploded into chaos, the city of Riverside never slept. Helicopters circled above federal buildings, lights sliced through fog, and news vans lined the courthouse steps like an army of silver insects. Inside a quiet office at FBI headquarters, Agent Sarah Carter stood before a wall of screens. Every feed showed a different state: warehouses in Dallas, safe houses in Denver, shipping docks in Miami. At exactly midnight, the order was given. Operation Ghostfall began. Dozens of teams moved simultaneously across the country. Unmarked vehicles rolled through dark streets. Doors splintered under steel rams. Radios crackled with short commands. The Clav cartel, which had poisoned half the nation for nearly a decade, was being dismantled piece by piece. Dante Williams' undercover work had mapped every route, every contact, every shell company. Months of silence had become a blueprint for justice. Sarah watched the feeds in silence. One by one, red markers on the screen turned green as targets were captured. Warehouse secured. Assets frozen. Evidence recovered. The network that Tank Morrison believed untouchable was collapsing in real time. She allowed herself a single, deep breath. Then she turned to the empty chair beside her. Dante should have been there, but he was still in holding, finishing his debriefing with internal affairs. Inside the Federal Holding Center, the air was different. No shouts, no filth, no smell of fear. Just the hum of electricity and the steady rhythm of security cameras. Dante sat at the table across from two agents, recounting every detail of his months inside Riverside. His voice was calm, steady, detached from emotion. He spoke of humiliation like he was describing weather. Each act of cruelty became a data point, each insult another note in the symphony of a criminal empire. When the interview ended, the senior agent closed the file. "You've done your part, Williams. Go home." Dante's gaze stayed fixed on the wall for a moment. Home wasn't a place he remembered anymore. It was a concept that had burned away somewhere between the first punch and the first prayer. He signed the final document, handed it back, and rose from his chair. Outside, the dawn broke over Washington like a slow confession. The news channels carried nothing else. The ghost had become headline material again, but this time not as a monster. Reporters repeated his name with reverence. Every network showed the same footage of Tank Morrison being dragged out of the courthouse in cuffs, shouting empty threats that no longer carried weight. The story spread across borders. Russian authorities coordinated arrests in Moscow. Mexican federal police raided distribution houses in Juarez and Monterrey. Interpol issued warrants for European partners linked through shell accounts. Within 72 hours, the entire Clav network was paralyzed. $200 million in assets frozen. Dozens of officials under investigation for corruption. In Riverside, the transformation began the moment federal control took over. Warden Patterson and 12 guards were escorted out in handcuffs, faces pale under the morning light. For the first time in 8 years, the prison yard was silent. No orders barked, no laughter from Tank's men. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something new begins. Carlos Mendez watched it happen from the medical wing. His ribs were healing, but his spirit already felt lighter. He knew the ghost had survived. The day Dante walked out of those gates, Carlos whispered a prayer under his breath. For the first time in years, it wasn't for survival. It was gratitude. Weeks later, Dante visited him. The two men sat facing each other across the small metal table in the infirmary. Carlos looked thinner but stronger. His eyes no longer carried that haunted look of a man trapped in endless war. "You should have told me," he said softly. Dante shook his head. "You already knew." Carlos smiled. "Maybe I did." Outside the window, workers painted over old graffiti. New signs went up promoting rehabilitation programs and education workshops. Federal officers inspected every corner of the facility. The change was slow, but it was real. Dante's mission had started as infiltration, but what it left behind was transformation. Tank Morrison, once untouchable, now sat in a cell smaller than the one he had given to his victims. ADX Florence, Supermax, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. No sounds of laughter or power echoed there, only the endless hum of air vents and the weight of silence. He spent 23 hours a day alone, staring at concrete. His reflection on the metal mirror was the only company he had left. He talked to it sometimes, whispering threats to the man who had destroyed him. But the mirror never answered. Rebecca Cross faced her own reckoning. The evidence of her tampering was overwhelming. Her emails with cartel contacts, her payments from offshore accounts, her manipulation of witnesses. The Bar Association stripped her license within a month. Reporters who once worshipped her brilliance now dissected her downfall. Her press conferences turned into apologies that no one believed. She had built her empire on lies, and it had crumbled faster than tanks. Sarah Carter presented the official report before Congress 2 months later. The investigation led to the largest organized crime takedown in U.S. history. 47 cartel members arrested, 12 corrupt officials charged, and more than $500 million in assets seized. But when asked about Agent Williams, she paused. "He's not a hero," she said quietly. "He's something rarer. A man who knew when not to fight." Dante refused public interviews. He spent his first days of freedom in silence, walking along the coast near Oakland where the waves met the rocks with patient rhythm. He watched the water break and reform endlessly, the same way pain transformed into something else if you let it flow long enough. Reporters followed him, but he never spoke. The story belonged to the world now. His part was finished, yet the world wouldn't let him go. Letters poured in from families who had lost children to drugs, from veterans battling trauma, from inmates who saw in him a reflection of what redemption could look like. The volume of pain waiting for someone to listen was staggering. Dante realized his mission wasn't over. The fight had simply changed shape. 6 months later, the Ghost Foundation opened its doors in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Oakland. The walls were covered with murals painted by local artists. One showed a man rising from fire, another a circle of hands holding one another. The motto beneath read, "True strength serves justice." The foundation offered free self-defense classes, legal aid, and counseling for families affected by violence. Carlos became the director of veteran outreach, working with former soldiers who struggled to find purpose. His calm voice guided hundreds through training sessions. Sarah visited often, helping coordinate law enforcement partnerships. Even Tommy Smith, the man once used as Tank's weapon, joined the effort. After recovering from his self-imposed coma, he turned witness for the prosecution. His testimony helped convict dozens. He later became an advocate for prison reform, touring schools and speaking about how hatred destroyed his life before compassion rebuilt it. Dante trained the children himself. Every morning, 30 young students lined up barefoot on the mats, waiting for his instruction. He taught them how to move, how to breathe, but more than that, he taught them the philosophy that had saved him. Power isn't violence, he said. It's control. It's knowing you could hurt someone and choosing not to. The Ghost Foundation grew faster than anyone predicted. Within a year, chapters opened in 15 states. Each one focused on rehabilitation, education, and the idea that no life was beyond saving. The media that once called him dangerous now called him a visionary. Still, Dante refused fame. When reporters asked for interviews, he pointed them toward the children. "Tell their stories," he said. "Mine is finished." Meanwhile, inside ADX Florence, Tank Morrison rotted. His muscles wasted, his hair turned gray, and his mind began to slip. He screamed at the walls, claiming he still had allies outside, but no one listened. The cartel had collapsed. The Russians had cut ties. The Mexicans had chosen peace. The empire he built through fear had turned to dust. The only name left echoing in his head was the Ghost. The government launched nationwide reforms inspired by the case. Federal prisons adopted ghost protocols, systems designed to eliminate gang dominance, improve rehabilitation, and protect vulnerable inmates. Violence dropped by 85% in the first year. For the first time in decades, correctional facilities began to live up to their name. They corrected. One morning, Dante received a letter marked with a federal seal. Inside was a simple note written by Judge Patricia Morrison. She thanked him for reminding her that justice could still be human. Enclosed was a photograph taken on the day of the verdict. It showed Dante standing between two agents, calm amid chaos. Behind him, the courtroom light caught his tattoo, glowing faintly through the fabric of his shirt. He placed the photo on the wall of the foundation beside a quote painted in careful strokes. "Redemption is not forgiveness. It is the courage to begin again." Years passed, and the story of the Ghost became legend. His book, When Ghosts Fight Back, topped bestseller lists around the world, but every cent from its sales went to victims of trafficking and drug violence. Hollywood came calling, and Dante reluctantly agreed to a film adaptation only if every profit went to charity. The film became a global phenomenon. It told the story of a man who endured hell to show the world that compassion could rise from cruelty. During the premiere, as applause filled the theater, Dante stood quietly at the back, watching actors reenact his life. The audience cried when the final scene showed the prison yard turning into a classroom. But what moved him most wasn't the story. It was the thought that somewhere out there, a child watching might believe they could be more than their pain. Back in Riverside, the real transformation was almost complete. The once violent prison now held computer labs, trade schools, and meditation halls. The statistics shocked the nation. Violence had fallen 90%. Recidivism was the lowest in history. Men who once fought over scraps now taught each other how to build futures. Carlos visited one afternoon, walking through the yard with a smile. "You remember what this place used to be?" he said. Dante nodded. It was hell. Carlos looked around at the gardens, the classrooms, the laughter. Now it's something close to redemption. In Washington, Congress passed the Ghost Act, requiring federal institutions to implement anti-bullying and rehabilitation programs modeled after Riverside. 15 countries followed with their own versions. What had begun as a fight between two men in a prison yard had become a global movement. Late one evening, Dante walked alone through the training hall of the Foundation. The lights were dim, the mats empty. He stopped in front of the mural depicting his tattoo, the man walking through flames toward the light. His reflection merged with it in the glass. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel pride. Not for the fights he won, but for the lives he helped heal. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere, a siren wailed, then faded. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere, a man put down a weapon because he remembered the ghost's story. And deep in the Rockies, Tank Morrison stared at his reflection on the metal mirror until it blurred. His voice cracked as he whispered into the empty air. "The ghost walks among us still." He was right, because the ghost had never been one man. It had become a symbol that moved through every act of courage, every hand that lifted another from the ground, every choice to protect instead of harm. The world had changed because one man refused to strike back, and as dawn broke over the city once more, the light spilled through the Foundation's windows and touched the mural, making it glow like fire. The ghost had found peace, but his legacy had just begun. The dawn that rose over Oakland 2 years later looked no different to anyone else, but for Dante Williams it felt like the first sunrise of a new life. The Ghost Foundation had outgrown the small warehouse where it began. Now it filled an entire city block, a place humming with quiet purpose. The sound of young voices learning discipline mixed with the clatter of keyboards from classrooms upstairs. The walls that once smelled of dust and decay now carried the scent of paint and sweat and hope. Every morning, Dante arrived before anyone else. He swept the mats himself, checked the equipment, and sat for 10 minutes of silence before the doors opened. That silence was his anchor. The world called him a hero now, a symbol of justice reborn. But he never let those words take root. He had walked through too much darkness to believe in perfection. He believed in work, in the daily act of choosing good over easy. When the first students arrived, he smiled and greeted them by name. They came from all corners of the city. Some were children from broken homes, others from families that simply wanted them to learn discipline. A few had been caught on the edge of gang life and brought here by social workers who begged for one last chance to save them. Each of them wore the same uniform, black shirts with the words, "True strength serves justice," printed across the back. Dante began each class the same way. He made them stand in silence for 1 full minute. No movement, no words, only breath. Most of them hated it at first. They fidgeted, giggled, rolled their eyes. But over time, they learned what stillness meant. In a world filled with noise, silence was strength. Carlos Mendez walked in carrying a stack of papers. He still limped slightly from old injuries, but his smile was steady. He handled the Foundation's veteran program, connecting former soldiers with at-risk youth. Many of the older men found healing by teaching discipline instead of fighting. Watching them pass on lessons of restraint rather than aggression was Dante's quiet victory. He nodded to Carlos as the Marine joined the class, guiding a group of new volunteers. These men had seen war and loss, and now they were learning to teach peace. It was something no bullet could have achieved. Outside the Foundation's walls, the ripple of change kept growing. The ghost protocols had transformed the country's prisons. Violence continued to drop. Rehabilitation replaced punishment. Riverside Correctional, once a pit of hate, had become a model facility where education and therapy were more common than fights. The government called it a miracle. Dante called it proof that pain could become purpose. One afternoon he returned to Riverside for the first time since his release. The car ride was silent. Sarah Carter sat beside him, now the head of the FBI's Undercover Operations Unit. She had insisted on accompanying him. When they arrived, the sight stunned them both. The walls that once echoed with screams now rang with music from a workshop. The yard where Tank Morrison had humiliated men for sport had been turned into a garden. Inmates worked quietly among rows of green plants, some tending vegetables, others painting murals on the walls. The warden, a young woman named Elise Grant, greeted them with pride. She had grown up watching the trial on television and joined corrections because of Dante's story. She guided them through the facility, explaining each change. Every inmate attended classes. Each man received counseling. Violence had fallen by 90%. She smiled as she said the words. The ghost protocols work. Dante walked to the center of the yard and stood where he once knelt in the dirt. The ground felt different beneath his feet, softer somehow. He closed his eyes and remembered Tank's voice, the laughter, the smell of slop running down his face. Then he opened his eyes again and saw only sunlight. The past no longer owned this place. Later, in a small office overlooking the garden, Elise showed him a new mural painted by the inmates. It depicted a man walking through fire toward a circle of light, his body half shadow, half flame. Beneath it were words that made Dante's throat tighten. From pain, we rise. When they left the prison, Sarah glanced at him. You did more than stop a cartel, she said. You changed what justice means. He shook his head gently. I only reminded them what it could be. Months passed. The foundation grew busier. Media attention returned after a film studio released a movie based on his life. Dante had refused payment, donating every cent to families destroyed by drugs and trafficking. The film broke records. The message spread worldwide. People saw that restraint was strength, that mercy could be powerful. Letters poured in from across the globe. One evening, Carlos entered Dante's office carrying a pile of mail. Most were thank you letters, but one caught his eye. It bore a foreign stamp. He handed it over quietly. Dante opened it and read the single line inside. The ghosts walk among us. Signed, Anonymous. He smiled faintly. Somewhere, someone understood. In the years that followed, the Ghost Foundation expanded overseas. Programs launched in Japan, Germany, and Brazil. Schools integrated its philosophy into physical education. The Ghost Act inspired international legislation focusing on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Dante traveled to speak before the United Nations, standing beneath a banner that read, Justice through Compassion. He spoke of discipline, humility, and the balance between strength and mercy. The hall fell silent as he finished. 1,000 diplomats applauded, but he only bowed his head and left the stage quietly. Back home, Carlos married a social worker who had volunteered at the foundation. Their wedding took place in the same training hall where it all began. The children Dante once trained acted as ushers, handing out small cards printed with a quote from the wall. True power protects the weak. During the ceremony, Sarah stood beside Dante, smiling. When the vows ended, Carlos turned to his old friend. You gave me back my life. Dante shook his head. You found it yourself. News came later that year from Colorado. Tank Morrison was dead. A heart attack in his cell, alone, without witnesses. No ceremony, no visitors, no legacy. The man who built his empire on cruelty had left the world in silence. When Dante heard the news, he didn't feel triumph, only a faint sadness that someone had chosen hatred over redemption. He went to the ocean that night and watched the tide come in. The waves erased footprints one by one, leaving nothing but smooth sand. That was all the closure he needed. Time moved gently after that. The foundation became self-sustaining, run by teams of instructors and volunteers. Dante taught less, but watched more, finding joy in seeing others lead. Children who once trembled when they arrived now guided younger students through drills. Their confidence grew not from fighting, but from learning how not to. A documentary crew visited to record a follow-up story. They interviewed parents, teachers, and former inmates whose lives had been changed by the ghost protocols. One of them was Tommy Smith, now a law graduate working for the Federal Reentry Program. He stood before the camera, shoulders squared, and said words that echoed Dante's own. "Violence was all I knew until someone stronger than hate showed me another way." When the film premiered, it ended with a shot of the Foundation's main hall. Dante stood before a mural of children training, their reflections glowing in the polished floor. The narrator's voice spoke the closing line. "Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who chooses peace." The audience rose to their feet in silence before applause filled the theater. Back at the Foundation, life continued its steady rhythm. Morning classes, afternoon training, evening reflection. The city outside changed, but inside those walls, the same quiet strength flowed. One afternoon, a small girl approached Dante after class. Her name was Lily. She had joined a month earlier after losing her older brother to gang violence. She looked up at him and asked why he never fought anymore. He knelt so their eyes met. "Because real fighting isn't about hurting," he said. "It's about protecting." She thought for a moment, then smiled. "I want to be like that." That night, Dante walked through the empty hall, remembering the faces of every student who had come through these doors. He realized the true mission was never about vengeance or even justice. It was about breaking the chain that bound pain to violence. He touched the mural one last time before turning off the lights. The years passed quietly. The Foundation thrived. New leaders rose. Dante aged, though time seemed to treat him gently. His hair carried threads of gray, his movements slower but still deliberate. The media called him a legend, a living myth, but to the people who knew him, he was simply the man who taught them to breathe. On the 10th anniversary of the Ghost Foundation, the city of Oakland held a ceremony in his honor. Thousands gathered in the plaza. Former students, veterans, families, and officials filled the space. Sarah spoke first, recounting the story of the man who changed how the world saw justice. When she finished, the crowd turned as Dante stepped to the microphone. The noise faded until only the sound of flags rustling in the wind remained. He spoke simply. "The greatest power any person can have is mercy. I learned that the hard way. Pain is a teacher. Forgiveness is freedom, and peace is strength." He looked over the crowd and saw faces shining with tears and pride. "Every person here carries the power to change the world," he said. "Use it well." The applause rolled through the square like thunder. Later that evening, when the celebration ended, Dante returned to the Foundation. The halls were quiet again, just as he liked them. The moonlight slipped through the windows, painting soft patterns on the mats. He sat in the center of the room, cross-legged, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed until the world disappeared into calm. Outside, a light breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere across the ocean, in another country following his methods, a teacher repeated his lesson to a new group of students. Real warriors protect others. True strength serves justice. In that moment, the legacy of the ghost was no longer a man but an idea. It lived in classrooms and prisons, in hearts and hands, in every place where someone chose compassion over cruelty. The ripple had become a wave. When dawn came again, it found him still sitting in silence. The first rays of light touched the mural, setting it aglow. Children began arriving, their laughter filling the hall. Dante stood, greeted them with a gentle smile, and began the day's lesson. Across the world, news outlets marked the anniversary of the Ghost Foundation. They showed footage of transformed prisons, thriving communities, and hopeful faces. They ended with the same image: Dante surrounded by children, teaching them not how to fight but how to stand with dignity. "The ghost walks among us still," the anchor said as the camera faded to black. "In every act of kindness, every moment of restraint, every hand that lifts another from the ground." And somewhere in the quiet of the morning, as the sound of training filled the air once more, Dante Williams breathed in peace and let it settle deep inside him. The man who had once walked through hell now lived in the light, and his silence said everything words could not. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check.